the bones of stone. The first thing Ezekiel Ironwood remembered about his childhood was the sound of water breathing against stone. It was a living sound, steady, patient, older than words. Long before he learned to read blueprints or command crews, he had memorized that rhythm. The gentle spill of current over limestone, the pulse of pressure that whispered of balance and strength. His grandfather used to say, "Every stone has a will. Zeke, you just need to listen long enough to understand what it wants to hold." Jeremiah Ironwood had built the dam in 1943, one slab at a time, cutting each block from local quarry rock and setting them without a drop of mortar. "Mortar cracks," he would say. "Fitted stones endure." He was right. For 80 years, the structure had endured through floods, droughts, tornado seasons, and the slow creep of suburban sprawl that devoured the old Missouri Valley, one cul-de-sac at a time. When Ezekiel came home from 23 years with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the dam was still there, gleaming pale under the sun like the vertebrae of a sleeping giant. It held back the creek's temper and gave life to the meadow beyond, a patchwork of cattails, mint, and frog song that smelled like wet earth and memory. He had planned to grow old beside it. Then they came, the developers, the homeowners, and finally the queen bee, who believed every landscape should match a brochure. Cordelia Blackthorne. The first time Cordelia showed up at his porch, she was smiling the way people smile when they already know the answer and only need your signature to make it official. She wore designer jeans that probably cost more than Zeke's monthly disability check and held a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. "Mr. Ironwood," she began, "we need to discuss your property's integration with community standards." Zeke leaned against one of Jeremiah's hand-carved porch posts. "Ma'am, my property was the community before yours existed." "That's precisely the problem," she said, as though she were diagnosing an illness. "Your dam is a safety hazard and an aesthetic concern. Several residents have complained." "Residents who moved here last year?" he asked. She ignored the jab, flipping to a page marked Infrastructure Compatibility. The smell of her perfume was crisp, floral, and to Zeke indistinguishable from arrogance. That was the first encounter. It should have ended with polite disagreement. Instead, it began a quiet war. Inheritance of Iron Zeke was a third-generation engineer, the kind who measured trust in millimeters. After decades of combat construction and flood zone rebuilding, he believed in two things: documentation and gravity. Both were impartial, and both could destroy a liar given enough time. When the HOA sent its first notice, $12,000 in infrastructure fees for a structure that had been standing since Roosevelt's administration, Zeke read it twice, then poured himself black coffee thick enough to chew. It wasn't just money. It was insult carved in legalese. According to the notice, his dam negatively impacted downstream management systems. Translation: it existed, therefore it was inconvenient. He called his daughter, Autumn, to vent. She was knee-deep in wedding plans and laughter when she answered. "Dad, please," she said, "don't let them ruin this week." "I'll handle decorations." "You handle not punching HOA presidents." Zeke promised nothing. The smell of diesel, too. Months later, while Autumn danced under strings of golden lights at her reception, diesel engines coughed awake down by the creek. When he returned that evening, still wearing his dress uniform jacket unbuttoned at the throat, the air was thick with exhaust and wet soil. Where the dam had stood for 80 years, there was only rubble and brown water foaming through broken stone. Cordelia stood on her deck, champagne glass glinting in the floodlights. "Emergency demolition," she called across the water. "Safety order." Zeke said nothing. His hands were shaking, not from age or fear, but from the weight of memory collapsing into mud. He knew then that some wars didn't end. They only changed uniforms, seeds of retaliation. By dawn, he had photographed everything: the debris, the machinery, the false permit dates smudged by greasy fingers. Old habits die hard. In the Corps, documentation had saved lives. Here, it would save legacy. Cordelia thought she'd won with one phone call to a friendly contractor. What she didn't know was that Ezekiel Ironwood had friends too. A retired judge, a stubborn widow, and half a dozen neighbors tired of paying emergency assessments for disasters that smelled suspiciously like someone's new Tesla lease. Justice, Zeke decided, flowed like water. And water always found the lowest point. The counterattack. The morning after the demolition, Zeke Ironwood stood in the silence of what used to be his dam. The mist still clung to the valley like a bruise, and the air reeked of diesel and churned mud. A single slab of limestone, his grandfather's cornerstone, remained upright, scarred but unbroken. He touched it with the same reverence a soldier gives a fallen comrade. "You held longer than they ever could," he murmured. The rock was slick beneath his calloused fingers, still cool from the creek that had once run calm and obedient. By noon, Cordelia's letter arrived, official header, legal tone, and a single sentence that tasted like poison. Any attempt to reconstruct the dam without HOA authorization will result in immediate legal action. Zeke read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a plastic folder labeled evidence. He didn't need a lawyer to tell him what this was. It wasn't a dispute about safety or infrastructure. It was a declaration of territory, the engineer's instinct. Every soldier knows the difference between chaos and design. The destruction hadn't been random. The excavator's cuts were precise, the removal orchestrated to leave no recoverable section intact. Someone had planned it, someone with knowledge of how to make a demolition look like a safety measure. Zeke went to his office that evening, pulled out his old field laptop, and started digging. The name on Cordelia's permit stood out immediately, Brantley Blackthorne. He almost laughed. The same surname as Cordelia. How convenient. Brantley was listed as a certified hydrology consultant from Austin, Texas. But Missouri required its own licensing for that work, a fact most bureaucrats overlooked. But no Army engineer ever forgot. Zeke checked the Missouri State Licensing Board database. No record found. He leaned back in his chair, a slow smile forming beneath the flicker of his desk lamp. "Got you," he whispered. "The first shot." Fired 3 days later, a complaint landed on the licensing board's desk, filed by one Ezekiel Ironwood, retired Corps engineer, regarding unlicensed hydrological practice resulting in unlawful property destruction. By the time Cordelia received the notice of investigation, whispers had already begun spreading through Willowbrook estates like wildfire. Dalton Greystone, a retired history teacher and one of Zeke's oldest neighbors, knocked on his door that same afternoon holding his own HOA assessment letter. "Zeke," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "I just paid $300 for drainage improvements that don't exist. What's going on?" Zeke poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table. "You ever hear the phrase, 'follow the money'?" Dalton's thin smile returned. History's first law of war. They spent the next 3 hours building a map of HOA expenditures from public documents. Most of the charges led back to the same phantom vendor, Blackthorne Landscaping Solutions, the leak in the foundation. That Sunday, Zeke attended the HOA meeting for the first time in 5 years. Cordelia sat at the head of the long table, immaculate in a white blazer, her composure polished to a mirror shine. She was used to controlling rooms like this, intimidating through charm and condescension in equal measure. "Mr. Ironwood," she said, her smile brittle, "you're not a dues-paying member of Willowbrook Estates. This meeting is for residents only." Zeke adjusted his worn jacket, the Army Corps emblem glinting faintly. "I'm a property owner, ma'am, which gives me every right to request financial transparency under Missouri's Sunshine Law." A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Cordelia's expression cracked just slightly. He held up a folder thick with printed pages. "According to state records, your hydrology consultant isn't licensed to practice here. That makes his report invalid, which means your demolition order was based on fraudulent documentation." Dalton spoke next, his teacher's voice cutting through the tension. "And while you were paying that consultant, our emergency fund vanished. So perhaps the HOA should explain where $84,000 went." Cordelia's perfect smile froze like porcelain. The room erupted, not with shouting, but with questions. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now wanted answers. And for the first time, Cordelia didn't have them. The war of paper by week's end, the community was divided. Half believed Cordelia's line about malicious rumors from an angry veteran. The other half began reading the HOA's fine print for the first time in their lives. Zeke didn't post on social media or shout in meetings. He simply collected evidence, every letter, every signature, every payment receipt he could find. His house slowly transformed into a war room, folders stacked by date, maps pinned with red strings connecting names, invoices, and bank accounts. The smell of coffee and printer ink filled the small office as night deepened. In one corner, the limestone fragment from the dam sat on a shelf beside Jeremiah's old level tool. It was more than memory, it was a promise. Zeke wasn't fighting for revenge anymore. He was fighting for truth. And like water, truth had its own gravity. It always found its way through cracks. The neighbors awakening within weeks, quiet alliances formed. Savannah Riverside, an elderly widow living on a fixed income, came to Zeke's porch carrying her own HOA bills. "Mr. Ironwood," she said softly, "I think I've been paying for a lawyer I never hired." She wasn't alone. One by one, residents brought their papers. Each story added weight to the growing mountain of evidence. And every night, Zeke logged it all, labeling files with precision only a military man could sustain. Cordelia must have sensed it, control slipping like sand between manicured fingers. Her emails grew shorter, sharper. When that failed, she turned to intimidation. County inspectors randomly showing up at Zeke's gate. Anonymous complaints about unstable veteran behavior, even letters from child services citing unsafe property conditions. It was a campaign of harassment straight from the bureaucrat's handbook. But Zeke had read that manual before, and he knew how to burn it page by page. A quiet declaration on a late autumn night, Zeke sat on his porch, watching fog curl along the creek bed where the dam once stood. The air was cold enough to bite. The silence was heavier now, filled with the ghosts of everything torn apart. He sipped his coffee and stared into the darkness, his reflection dim in the black water. In his notebook, he wrote a single line under the day's entry. "Cordelia thinks she understands control. She's forgotten one thing. Water remembers." He closed the book, the faint sound of distant frogs echoing like applause in the night. The counterattack had begun. The legal storm autumn came early that year, carrying the kind of chill that makes wood pop in the walls and thoughts turn sharper. Willowbrook's trees wore colors of slow decay, amber, bronze, the red of old wounds, and beneath their branches, the neighborhood simmered like a pot about to boil. Zeke Ironwood moved quietly through it all. The soldier's walk still in his spine, deliberate, balanced, unreadable. He no longer answered Cordelia's emails, no longer attended her carefully staged community safety briefings. He didn't need to. The battle had shifted from the surface of politics to the undercurrent of law, where patience wins and evidence speaks louder than anger. Each morning he brewed strong coffee, set it beside the growing archive of files, and logged the previous night's notes. Savannah brought him receipts. Dalton typed up minutes from closed-door HOA meetings he'd secretly recorded. Preston Ashworth, a former board member who'd resigned months earlier in frustration, arrived one evening with a cardboard box. Inside were copies of financial statements stamped confidential. "Cordelia used to make me sign these before every vote," Preston said, pushing the box toward Zeke. "Now you'll see why." Zeke didn't open it right away. He simply nodded, gratitude flickering behind his weathered face. "You did the right thing," he said. "Now we finish what they started. Numbers don't lie." The next 3 nights blurred together. Pages spread across the kitchen table, figures climbing and twisting into patterns that smelled of corruption. Savannah's sharp eyes spotted it first. "Look here," she said, pointing with a trembling finger. 3 invoices in the same week to Blackthorn Landscaping Solutions. Same description, same amount, $200,000, but paid from 3 different HOA accounts. Dalton let out a low whistle. "That's not bookkeeping, that's laundering." Zeke compared signatures, tracing each stroke of Cordelia's looping cursive. "She's been siphoning community money for years," he said. The dam wasn't a liability. It was a cover story. Outside, the creek murmured through its broken channel, as though eavesdropping. Marlo Chen, when the evidence became too heavy to keep at home, Zeke called the one person he trusted with both law and conscience. Marlo Chen, environmental attorney, former Corps legal liaison, and the only lawyer he'd ever heard use profanity like punctuation when talking about HOAs. They met in her downtown office, walls lined with case files and framed photographs of rivers she'd helped save from illegal developments. "Zeke Ironwood," she said, shaking his hand firmly. I read about your demolition. Damn shame, pun not intended. He set the folders on her desk. You'll want to see these before you joke again. She flipped through pages, her brows lowering with every line. Unlicensed consultants, fraudulent assessments, embezzlement trails, and wait, offshore accounts. She looked up. You realize you're not talking about civil violations anymore. This is federal. Then we take it federal, he said simply. Marlowe smiled, the slow, dangerous kind of smile that lawyers get when they smell victory beneath paperwork. You just made my week. The community turns within days. Quiet rumor turned into open rebellion. Neighbors who'd once whispered now spoke openly at mailboxes and grocery aisles. Did you hear about the offshore funds? They say she forged the permits. My dues went up again. What's she really paying for? Cordelia fought back the only way she knew, more paperwork. Emergency assessments, legal threats, new safety inspections. But every letter she sent became another nail in her own coffin. Marlowe filed them all, each stamped evidence in bold red ink. Zeke didn't celebrate. He'd seen too many battles won too early. She's cornered, he told Dalton one evening. Cornered things bite hardest. The federal threat, it was Marlowe who made the call that changed everything. She had a friend in the Department of Justice, someone who'd worked white-collar crimes before joining the Environmental Crimes Task Force. 2 weeks later, Agent Roland Grimm showed up in Sahiwal County disguised as an insurance investigator with a smile like winter steel. Mr. Ironwood, he said, extending his badge briefly before tucking it away. I hear you've got a flood problem and a paper trail. Zeke led him to the kitchen, where maps and spreadsheets covered every inch of oak. Grimm studied them silently, then nodded. You've done half our job already. What you're looking at, wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, it's big enough to wake the Bureau. Dalton blinked. You mean FBI big? Bigger, Grimm replied. Because your HOA president's been transferring funds through Cayman accounts tied to a construction shell used in 3 other states. She's not just greedy, she's connected. Zeke's knuckles tightened around his mug. Then let's cut those connections. Pressure rising. The following month felt like living under siege. Cordelia unleashed a barrage of intimidation. Inspectors at dawn, citations for imaginary code violations, rumors that Zeke was mentally unstable. Local gossip columns lapped it up, portraying her as a misunderstood reformer battling a hostile veteran. Marlowe told him to stay calm. Let her talk, she said. Every word digs her hole deeper. But calm wasn't easy when strangers photographed your home and county trucks parked across your gate. Some nights, Zeke lay awake listening to the wind sweep through the valley, carrying the faint hiss of the broken creek. It sounded like breathing, like the dam itself whispering patience. He whispered back, I'm trying. Breaking point. Everything changed the morning Savannah arrived in tears, clutching a notice. They're raising dues again, she said. Double to cover legal defense expenses. We're paying her lawyers to fight us. Zeke took the paper, jaw tightening. Enough was enough. That evening, he and Marlowe drafted the first of 3 legal actions. Federal, complaint for fraudulent assessments in wire, fraud. 2, civil suit for property destruction under Missouri. Statutes. 3, injunction request freezing. HOA assets pending investigation. By nightfall, the documents were filed, time-stamped, and irrevocable. For the first time since the demolition, Zeke slept soundly. The flood before Justice Cordelia's composure began to crack in public. At the next HOA meeting, her speech slurred from exhaustion, or maybe panic. These accusations are baseless, she snapped. Our leadership stands for safety and community. Dalton stood from his chair, calm and cold. Then you won't mind showing us the books. No one here has the right to, Savannah interrupted, her voice trembling but firm. We have every right. We paid for this neighborhood. You just stole it, the crowd erupted. Phones recorded. And somewhere in the back, Agent Grimm filmed everything with the smallest smile imaginable. Operation Stillwater. The next stage unfolded quietly. Grimm's team built a net of subpoenas and digital warrants, tracing every transaction from Cordelia's accounts to offshore banks. They found falsified invoices, insurance claims prepared before the demolition, and internal emails referencing controlled damage for strategic reimbursement. In plain language, she had planned the destruction. Marlowe kept Zeke informed, but cautioned restraint. We're weeks away from indictments. Don't spook her, Zeke nodded. But inside, a storm was building. Slow, relentless, as inevitable as gravity. He visited the ruins of the dam one last time before winter, standing on the wet stones that still bore the marks of steel claws. The creek flowed uncontrolled, eroding what remained of the old channel. Not yet, he whispered to the ghosts in the water. But soon. The calm before the raid winter froze the valley solid. Willowbrook's ornamental ponds turned to glass, and even Cordelia's perfect lawn lay brittle under frost. She withdrew from public view, citing stress leave, but her lawyers worked overtime behind closed doors. Zeke's group met weekly at his farmhouse, Dalton. Savannah, Preston, Marlowe, and sometimes Grimm. They shared updates over coffee and plans scribbled on napkins. What began as revenge had evolved into purpose. "This isn't about one dam anymore," Marlowe said one night, rubbing her eyes behind thick glasses. "It's about showing people like her that small crimes stack up until they drown entire communities." Zeke looked out the window toward the frozen creek. Moonlight turned it silver, a vein of quiet power winding through the dark. "Then we make sure the world sees it," he said. "All of it." The Fall of Cordelia. By late March, the snow had melted, revealing more than just winter's wreckage. Beneath the thin crust of ice, the creek ran wild again, clawing at its banks as if eager to reclaim what had been stolen. Every surge of brown water sounded like a heartbeat, steady and angry. Zeke listened from his porch, coat collar turned up against the wind, and waited for the next move. He didn't have to wait long. The storm breaks at 6:42 a.m. on a gray Wednesday. Marlowe's number flashed on his phone. "It's time," she said. "Federal warrants signed at dawn. They're moving today." Zeke closed his notebook, a slow exhale leaving frost in the cold air. "Then let's see what justice looks like in daylight." By mid-morning, unmarked SUVs rolled quietly into Willowbrook Estates. The neighborhood's prized silence fractured beneath the hum of government engines. Two agents in dark coats approached Cordelia's house, badges glinting like small suns. A third filmed the entire approach. Inside, Cordelia was already awake, preparing for what she believed would be a press interview to set the record straight. She'd even arranged her white blazer on the sofa, a symbol of purity she no longer possessed. When the knock came, she smiled automatically. "Come in, Channel 5. The smile froze as the taller agent spoke. "Mrs. Cordelia Blackthorne, federal warrant for your arrest. For the first time in 2 years. The Queen of Willowbrook forgot how to speak. The arrest neighbors gathered at driveways, coffee cups steaming in hand, watching as Cordelia stepped out between agents, hands trembling inside cuffs that gleamed colder than her jewelry. Cameras appeared from nowhere, local reporters tipped off by Marlowe's discreet phone call the night before. Dalton murmured, "I taught 30 years and never saw a lesson land this perfectly." Savannah just wept quietly. "About time," she whispered. Cordelia kept her chin high, whispering to one of the agents, "This is all a mistake. I am the community." Zeke, standing across the street, replied softly to no one in particular, "That's exactly the problem." The evidence flood within 48 hours. Headlines spilled across state media. HOA president arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Veteran engineer uncovers massive embezzlement in suburban development. Agent Grimm's report laid out every detail: wire transfers, falsified permits, insurance fraud, even attempts to bribe witnesses. Cordelia's digital trail was so blatant, it read like a confession typed in bold. She had destroyed Zeke's damned trigger insurance payouts and cover a deficit she'd created through phantom vendors and offshore accounts. Federal prosecutors called it the most elaborate HOA fraud in state history. Marlowe called it something simpler: justice with receipts. The aftermath: Cordelia's frozen accounts funded immediate restitution. Residents received reimbursement checks that looked surreal in trembling hands. The HOA dissolved within weeks. Its charter, once written in corporate pride, now sat in evidence lockers beside hard drives and empty perfume bottles. But victory never feels like fireworks to those who fought the longest. For Zeke, it came as quiet exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones after years of resistance. He stood again at the creek's edge, where limestone rubble still dotted the banks like broken teeth. Autumn found him there, her boots crunching through gravel. "You did it, Dad," she said softly. "It's over." He shook his head. "It's never over. You rebuild, you maintain, you protect. That's how you make over mean something. Rebuilding." The community didn't wait for grants or speeches. They rebuilt with their own hands, neighbors who'd once glared across fences now hauling stone together. Dalton designed educational plaques about water management. Savannah cooked hot meals for volunteers. Marlowe organized permits the right way, and Zeke, though his knees ached and his hair had gone the color of the creek in moonlight, lifted each limestone block like an offering. Piece by piece the wall rose again, stronger, wider, alive. When the first trickle of clear water spilled over the new crest, a cheer rippled through the valley. Zeke simply smiled, one hand resting on the stone. "Welcome home," he said. Echoes. Months later, documentaries would call it the Ironwood case. Universities studied it as a model for civic transparency. Congressmen cited it in debates about homeowner law reform. But for the people of Willowbrook, the real miracle wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in the laughter of children fishing by the restored dam, in the smell of limestone warmed by sun, in the newfound habit of neighbors knocking before judging. Cordelia, sentenced to 5 years and permanent restitution, vanished into the federal system. Her name became shorthand for arrogance undone by community. And yet Zeke never spoke her name again. "Let the water carry it away," he'd say. Legacy 2 years passed. The Ironwood Dam stood flawless, bearing a bronze plaque. Built 1943, restored 2024. Water always wins. Autumn's children learned to skip stones across its mirrored surface. And every spring the valley bloomed with wild mint, the same scent that had followed Jeremiah, then Zeke, through decades of endurance. On quiet mornings, Zeke sat by the water with coffee and an old notebook. Inside its worn pages were sketches, receipts, fragments of memory, and one final entry written in a steady hand. "Justice isn't loud. It's patient. It flows, carves, and returns. Like water, it remembers where it's been, and it always finds its way home." He closed the notebook, listening to the murmur that had begun his life and would outlast it. And when a breeze lifted across the surface, scattering sunlight in small, trembling diamonds, Ezekiel Ironwood smiled, because the dam still held, because the water still sang, because he finally understood that the sound he'd grown up with wasn't just running water, it was legacy, flowing, eternal, and free. The legacy beyond Willowbrook, the years that followed the Willowbrook scandal rolled by like slow water. Missouri's summers grew hotter, the winters shorter, but the creek beside the Ironwood farmhouse never lost its voice. If anything, it spoke clearer now, its current lighter, freer, its surface reflecting not ruin but rebirth. Zeke had grown leaner, slower in his movements, yet sharper in his eyes. He'd outlived wars, bureaucracy, and small-town politics, and the weight of those battles had carved its own landscape across his face. He carried that map quietly, content to live among the echoes of what he'd rebuilt. Every morning began the same. Coffee, the creak of his porch step, the sight of mist lifting off the dam. He would sit there, notebook balanced on his knee, and listen. To anyone else it might have sounded like ordinary water. To Zeke it was memory, alive, stubborn, unbroken. Echoes turned movement. The Ironwood case didn't end at the courthouse. Its shockwave rippled outward through every subdivision, township, and state where homeowners associations had quietly evolved into miniature kingdoms. Reporters called it the Missouri model. Lawmakers called it proof that ordinary citizens could dismantle extraordinary corruption. But to Zeke, it was simply consequence, the natural current of truth finding the lowest point. Marlo Chen's career exploded in the wake of the trial. She became the nation's leading voice on HOA transparency, testifying before Congress with the calm fury of someone who had seen lives crushed by bureaucratic greed. In interviews, she never mentioned herself. She always said, "It started with one man who refused to be quiet about what was stolen." Dalton Greystone turned their research into an educational program for retired teachers and veterans who wanted to learn community law. Savannah Riverside ran it from her kitchen, converting her dining table into a war room of binders and coffee-stained lessons on sunshine laws, FOIA requests, and the power of asking questions no one wants answered. Every HOA has its Cordelia, Dalton would say, pointer tapping a whiteboard, and every town needs its Zeke. The ripple reaches the capital 2 years later. Missouri passed the Homeowner Transparency and Oversight Act. It mandated open audits, resident voting rights, and criminal penalties for unauthorized financial assessments. The law included a single quote in its preamble, engraved into the first signed copy that hung in the State House lobby: "Control without accountability is corruption wearing manners." Ezekiel Ironwood. Testimony before the Senate Subcommittee on Civic Governance. Zeke hadn't wanted to testify. He hated microphones and politicians who smiled too easily. But when he stood there under the fluorescent glare of the state capitol and saw the gallery filled with families from other neighborhoods, the widows, veterans, young couples who'd lost homes to fraudulent boards, he realized silence was a kind of betrayal. He spoke for 20 minutes, his voice calm and steady, like the current under stone. When he finished, the room was silent. Then came applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that breaks through cynicism and makes people remember what decency sounds like. Beyond the courtroom, the national news moved on eventually, as it always does. New scandals replaced the old, new villains inherited old tricks. But in quiet pockets of the country, change stuck. Small towns began holding Ironwood forums, open gatherings where residents discussed bylaws before they became weapons. Community colleges offered courses in civic accountability, often taught by Marlowe or Dalton. And the Department of Justice created a task force on community-level financial crimes, training agents using the Willowbrook case as a model. Agent Roland Grimm, now retired, sent Zeke a postcard every year on the anniversary of Cordelia's arrest. The first one read simply, "Water found its level." The next year's, "Still flowing." Zeke kept them tucked between pages of his grandfather's engineering journal. Autumn's children. Autumn's family lived just a few miles down the road now, in a renovated farmhouse overlooking the dam. Her husband, Matthew, taught at the local school. Their twin boys, Jeremiah and Jonas, had inherited their grandfather's curiosity and their great-great-grandfather's stubbornness. They visited every Sunday, running down to the creek before anyone could stop them. "Grandpa," Jeremiah would shout, "the fish are back." Zeke would grin, leaning on his cane. "Of course they are. They know where home is." One afternoon, as the boys skipped stones, Autumn sat beside him on the old porch. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "All the fighting, the years it took from you?" He thought about that, the sleepless nights, the letters, the mud, the tears. "No," he said finally, "because it gave something back to everyone else." "Sometimes that's the trade," she smiled, though her eyes glistened. "Then you built more than a dam, Dad." He looked out at the water, the sun glinting gold along its curve. "Maybe," he said, "but a dam's still a good start." The story spreads 5 years after the scandal. A documentary team arrived from PBS. They wanted to film the restored dam, the rebuilt neighborhood, and the man who had become a reluctant folk hero. Zeke resisted at first, but Autumn persuaded him. "People should know what it costs to stand up," she said. "Not just what it wins." The documentary aired nationwide under the title, "Water Remembers: The Ironwood Legacy." Viewers saw old photographs of Jeremiah in 1943, hammer in hand, grainy footage of Cordelia's arrest, and the quiet dignity of Zeke sitting beside the dam at sunset. The closing narration came from his own recorded interview. They said it was about unpaid fees, but it was never about money. It was about who decides what's worth saving. "My grandfather taught me that water can't be owned. It can only be guided. If you force it, it breaks you. If you respect it, it carries you. And in the end, it always finds its way home." The film won awards it didn't need. What mattered more were the letters that began arriving in Zeke's mailbox. Handwritten notes from strangers across the country. A woman from Arizona. "Your story gave us the courage to challenge our board." A veteran from Ohio. "Thank you for showing that standing up doesn't end when service does." A teenager from California. "My dad says you remind him of his dad." Zeke read them all, quietly humbled, then tucked them into the same drawer as Grimm's postcards. The final current one spring morning, years later, Zeke rose before dawn. The air was cool and smelled of mint. The horizon blushed pink as mist clung low over the valley. He walked slowly to the dam, cane tapping the stones in rhythm with the water's pulse. At the top he stopped. The limestone blocks were damp with dew, glowing faintly in the first light. The water poured clean and smooth over their edge, a living hymn written in sound. He closed his eyes, letting the breeze comb through his silver hair. He could almost hear Jeremiah's voice, faint but steady. Fitted stones endure. Zeke smiled. They sure do, old man. From the distance came the laughter of his grandchildren. He turned toward it, heart full and easy. The world had moved on, but the current still flowed. It would always flow, and somewhere in that endless sound, between the rush and the hush, between what was lost and what was rebuilt, lived every lesson he had ever learned. That justice isn't loud, that patience is a weapon, that water remembers, and that even after everything falls apart, you can build again, stone by stone, truth by truth, until the sound of what you've saved drowns out the memory of what they tried to take. Epilogue. The river at dawn 50. Years had passed since the sound of falling stone first broke the silence of Willowbrook Valley. The creek had changed names twice, its water quality improved by federal programs Ezekiel Ironwood's fight had inspired. But to the locals it was still called Ironwood Creek. And the dam, though modernized and reinforced, still bore the same bronze plaque, weathered by rain and sun. Water always wins. Children read it every field trip day, tracing the letters with small fingers, never quite realizing how many lives those 3 words had carried. The Museum of Quiet Revolutions, a new museum, stood beside the dam now, small, glass-walled, simple. Its sign read, "The Museum of Quiet Revolutions, Civic Courage in American Communities." Inside, under a spotlight, rested Ezekiel's old engineering notebook, creased, coffee-stained, still faintly smelling of the porch where it had lived for decades. Beside it, a looping video played archival footage, Zeke testifying before the Missouri Senate. Cordelia's arrest, the rebuilding effort, and a much older Zeke smiling faintly at the water. Every few minutes, a recording of his voice played softly over hidden speakers. You don't fight corruption with noise. You fight it with patience, truth, and paper trails. Because lies rot in daylight, visitors often paused, hands clasped, as if listening not just to a man but to the current of something larger than him. Autumn's legacy, Autumn Ironwood, now gray-haired, gentle and still sharp-eyed, served as honorary curator. Her own daughter, Evelyn, taught environmental law at the nearby university, while Jeremiah and Jonas ran a local engineering firm specializing in sustainable water management. The Ironwood family had become less a lineage and more a philosophy. They didn't speak much about legacy. They just lived it, repairing, restoring, reminding. Each year, on the anniversary of the dam's rebuilding, families gathered along the water. They laid wreaths of mint and wildflowers on the surface and watched them drift downstream, a ritual that had no script, only memory. The letter in the stone one summer. During a routine maintenance inspection, Jeremiah's son, Luke Ironwood, 16 and full of questions, discovered something wedged between 2 foundation stones. It was a metal capsule, small and sealed tight. Inside lay a folded letter, the paper yellowed but still legible. It was dated April 12, 2025, Zeke's handwriting. Luke carried it to his grandmother, Autumn, who read it under the dim light of her porch. If someone finds this, it means the dam still stands. And if it still stands, then the truth held longer than fear. Don't think of this place as a monument. Think of it as a promise that patience can be stronger than power, and that one honest voice can outlast 1,000 signatures. She pressed the paper to her chest, eyes wet but smiling. Your great-grandfather always did have a way with words, she whispered. Full circle. The night before the 50th anniversary ceremony, the valley filled with people. Some came from out of state, some from down the road, some carrying children who would one day tell this story again. As the sun dipped low, Evelyn took the stage and spoke into the golden light. We gather here not to remember a man who fought, but a man who built. Because the fight ends when the wall holds. Because the wall holds when truth does. Her words carried softly over the murmuring crowd, blending with the sound of water over stone, the same sound that had marked every chapter of their history. And somewhere in that echo, in the rhythm of flow and fall, it felt as though Ezekiel Ironwood himself was still there, watching, quiet, proud, eternal. The final scene. As dusk melted into night, the crowd dispersed. Luke lingered by the water, the stars reflecting in the current. He bent down, picked up a flat stone, and skimmed it across the surface. It skipped 3 times, then vanished into the silver reflection of the moon. He smiled, whispering words he had memorized from the museum wall. Justice isn't loud. It's patient. And as he turned to leave, the wind shifted, gentle, whispering through cattails, carrying the faint sound of water brushing stone. A sound that had never really stopped,